smell of hearty food simmering on the stove while the wind howled outside is one thing that can take us straight back to Grandma's kitchen. Back then, the cellar and pantry were filled with crops most of us hardly see anymore, the kind that carried families through when gardens froze. These roots and greens weren't fancy, but they gave us full plates, warm suppers, and a sense of comfort we never forgot. They were part of the rhythm of fall, planted with care and remembered with love. So today, let's look back at 20 forgotten fall crops that helped our families make it through the coldest months of the year. Salsify. Grandma sometimes grew a crop called salsify, though many today would hardly recognize it. Long and thin, with a rough brown skin, it was often called the oyster plant because its flavor carried a hint of the sea. In the fall, she dug the roots and set them aside for winter meals. Peeled and boiled or mashed with butter, salsify was a treat when fresh vegetables were scarce. Families remembered its creamy taste served alongside potatoes or tucked into soups that simmered on wood stoves. Children often wrinkled their noses at its odd look, but once it was cooked, the flavor won them over. Salsify was never flashy, but it earned a place in the cellar as one of those forgotten crops that quietly helped keep families fed. Skirret. In some gardens, tucked among the familiar rows, there was a plant with roots that looked like a tangle of pale, skinny carrots. That was skirret, a vegetable our grandparents knew well, but most of us have never tasted. Dug in the fall, its roots were sweet and nutty, with a flavor somewhere between a carrot and a parsnip. In the kitchen, Grandma might boil them until tender, mash them with butter, or drop them into a stew for extra body. Children remembered carrying muddy clusters to the pump, rinsing them in freezing water before bringing them inside. Skirret wasn't flashy, and it never became as common as beets or turnips, but it earned its place by being steady. When other foods were scarce, it was another root that kept families fed. Mangelwurzel Beet. The name alone was enough to make kids laugh, but Mangelwurzel was no joke when it came to feeding families. These beets grew to enormous sizes, sometimes heavy enough that it took both hands to carry them in from the garden. Grandma stored them in the cellar through the winter, where they lasted for months without losing their strength. Cooked slowly, the roots had a mild, earthy flavor that filled empty plates when other foods had run out. Some families even fed the extra-large mangels to animals, a way of making sure nothing ever went to waste. Children remembered the sight of the oversized roots piled high in baskets. Strange, but dependable. Mangelwurzel may have slipped from our gardens today, but it once stood as a true crop of survival. Hamburg Parsley. Not every root in Grandma's cellar was familiar at first glance. Hamburg parsley looked like a pale carrot, but carried the flavor of parsley in both its leaves and roots. Families used the greens as seasoning, while the roots were saved for soups, stews, and roasts. Their taste was earthy, somewhere between a carrot and celery, and they fit easily into hearty winter meals. Children remembered the smell of it simmering with potatoes and onions, a scent that filled the kitchen on long evenings. Harvested in fall, the roots stored well, giving steady food long after the garden froze. Though it rarely appears in modern kitchens, Hamburg parsley was once treasured as a two-in-one crop, offering both seasoning and substance that stretched meals when every bite counted. Claytonia. In the quiet corners of fall gardens, Grandma sometimes grew Claytonia, a green many today have forgotten. Its tender, spoon-shaped leaves stayed fresh and bright, even when frost settled on the ground. Families picked handfuls to toss into salads or simmer into soups, grateful for something green when most vegetables were gone. Children remembered brushing away light snow to find Claytonia still standing, the leaves crisp and cool to the touch. It was one of those crops that asked for almost nothing yet gave food when it was needed most. Long before grocery stores shipped in lettuce from far away, Claytonia kept suppers lively through the cold months. It was a reminder that even the humblest plants had a way of making sure our tables never felt empty. Cardoon. At first glance, Cardoon looked like a tall thistle with silver-gray stalks and wide leaves that towered in Grandma's garden. But beneath its prickly appearance was a crop families valued in the colder months. The thick stalks were cut, peeled, and cooked until tender, carrying a flavor much like artichoke. In stews or baked dishes, Cardoon added richness that turned simple meals into something special. Families often remembered the sight of the tall plants swaying in autumn winds, a sign that food was still growing strong. Children sometimes helped strip the stalks, their hands sticky with sap as they laughed at the unusual job. Though rare today, Cardoon once had a place in many kitchens, proving that even strange-looking crops could bring warmth to winter suppers. Chicory Root. In many homes, the smell of coffee was a comfort even when beans were too costly. That's when Grandma turned to chicory. Its thick roots were dug in the fall, scrubbed clean, then roasted until dark and ground fine. Mixed with a little coffee or brewed on its own, it made a hot drink that kept families going through the cold months. Children remembered the rich, nutty scent drifting through the kitchen, not knowing it wasn't real coffee at all. Some roots were cooked as vegetables too, their bitterness tamed in soups and stews. Chicory root stretched supplies, saved money, and gave warmth on winter mornings when little else was available. It was one of those quiet crops that earned its place in both pantry and memory. Jerusalem artichoke, behind Grandma's garden fence. Tall sunflowers sometimes hid a secret crop. Jerusalem artichokes. Beneath the soil, their knobby tubers multiplied quickly, waiting to be dug after the first frost. Families roasted them like potatoes, or boiled them for soups, their nutty, sweet flavor filling the kitchen with a welcome smell. Children often helped pull the crooked roots from the dirt, their fingers caked in mud as they laughed at the odd shapes. Some folks even called them sunchokes, and though they weren't fancy, they filled bowls when money was tight. Stored in the ground, they could be dug all winter, making them a reliable food when cupboards ran low. Jerusalem artichokes may be overlooked today, but for Grandma, they were a dependable friend through the cold season. Crosnes, tucked away in some gardens, were little knots of roots called Crosnes. They looked almost like strings of tiny pearls, twisted and curled in the dirt. Grandma dug them in the fall, rinsed them well, and fried or boiled them for a crisp, nutty bite. Families remembered the surprise of such an unusual crop, one that children often treated like treasure as they washed each piece at the pump. Crosnes weren't as filling as potatoes, but they added something different to the table when food was plain. Their mild flavor and crunch gave suppers a bit of variety during the cold months. While they never became common, the memory of their strange shapes and gentle taste lingered in kitchens where every harvest mattered. Good King Henry. Near the edge of the garden, Grandma often left a patch of Good King Henry, a well-known green in the past, but most of us never planted it. Its leaves came back each year, ready to pick in the cool of fall. Cooked down like spinach, it was a dependable green for soups or side dishes when other plants had faded. Children remembered the earthy smell rising from the pot as it bubbled slowly on the stove. The plant asked for little care, and once it was in the ground, it came back faithfully, year after year. Families leaned on it in lean times, grateful for any food that returned on its own. Good King Henry was a humble perennial that helped keep the table steady through many hard winters. Sea kale, when most greens had vanished from the garden, Grandma could still count on sea kale. Its thick roots sent up shoots even in the cool of fall, and those stalks found their way to the supper table when fresh food was scarce. Cooked down like cabbage or creamed with butter, it was mild and filling, a welcome dish on cold nights. Families remembered gathering the leaves in baskets, their hands chilled by the autumn air, knowing this crop would stretch meals a little further. Sea kale wasn't planted in great fields, but it came back year after year, dependable and steady. In a time when every bite mattered, it gave families a green vegetable long after summer had ended, carrying them through the colder months ahead. Upland Cress. When the weather cooled, Grandma often gathered upland cress, a peppery little green that thrived in the fall. It grew low to the ground, carpeting damp spots in the garden with small, tender leaves. Picked fresh, it was tossed into salads or stirred into soups, its sharp flavor brightening even the plainest meals. Families relied on it for quick greens when larger crops were gone. Children remembered crouching down to pull handfuls, their fingers chilled by the cool soil. The cress grew back quickly, making it a steady food source until frost grew too heavy. It was never planted in great rows like collards or turnips, but its presence was always welcome. Upland cress was one of those forgotten greens that carried flavor and strength through long autumn days. Horseradish down in the corner of the garden, Grandma kept a patch of horseradish. It wasn't grown for bulk like potatoes or turnips, but its sharp white roots played a big part in winter meals. Dug in late fall, the roots were grated into sauces that cut through the heaviness of stored meats and root vegetables. Families remembered the fiery smell filling the kitchen, eyes watering as the root was freshly scraped. A spoonful mixed with vinegar turned plain roasts into something lively and bright. Children sometimes laughed and coughed at the sting, but the flavor became part of the season. Horseradish kept well in cellars, lasting months, and gave variety to suppers when food was otherwise plain. It was a small crop, but it helped families endure the long winter table. Rutabaga. In Grandma's cellar, baskets of rutabagas often sat alongside potatoes and turnips. These hardy roots, with their purple tops and golden flesh, were planted in late summer and harvested just before the ground froze. They grew sweeter after a touch of frost, which made them perfect for winter meals. Families boiled and mashed them, roasted them with meats, or cut them into stews that simmered slowly on the stove. Children remembered the heavy smell of rutabagas cooking, a scent tied to cold evenings and simple suppers. Stored properly, they lasted for months, feeding households deep into winter. Though they've slipped from most gardens today, rutabagas once stood as dependable keepers, offering strength and nourishment when little else remained fresh. They were true staples of survival in hard seasons. Black radish. In the fall, Grandma sometimes grew black radishes, their rough, dark skins hiding crisp white flesh. Unlike the small red radishes of spring, these were larger and built for storage. Pulled before the ground froze, they were tucked into bins of sand or straw, where they lasted well into winter. Their strong, peppery bite added life to stews, salads, and cold suppers, when food was otherwise heavy and plain. Families remembered slicing them thin and sprinkling them with salt, a sharp taste that woke up tired meals. Children often wrinkled their noses at the flavor, but they learned to eat them when choices were few. Black radishes weren't delicate or sweet, but they were hardy, dependable, and ready to fill the table long after the rest of the garden was gone. Winter savory. Among the jars of dried herbs in Grandma's pantry, winter savory was one that found its way into many dishes. This old perennial was gathered in the cool months, its small, pungent leaves adding flavor to beans, meats, and root vegetables. It was sometimes called the bean herb, since it helped season the pots that simmered slowly through long evenings. Families remembered its sharp, peppery scent filling the kitchen as soups bubbled on the stove. Children often helped strip the stems, their fingers sticky with the oils, before the leaves were dried and stored. Winter savory didn't feed families by bulk, but it made the simple foods of fall and winter taste richer. In times when meals were plain, it gave warmth and comfort from a single handful of leaves. Celeriac. In Grandma's cellar, there were often roots that looked too knobby to eat, but celeriac proved its worth once it hit the pot. Sometimes called celery root, it carried the same fresh flavor as celery, but lasted far longer through the cold months. Dug in fall and trimmed of its tangled roots, it was stored in boxes of sand, where it stayed firm for weeks. Families used it in soups, stews, or mashed with potatoes, giving meals a flavor that brightened otherwise heavy food. Children remembered the earthy smell as the rough bulbs were scrubbed clean at the sink, revealing the pale flesh inside. Though never a common sight today, celeriac once filled a gap in winter kitchens, adding both nourishment and taste when fresh greens were gone. Scorzonera. Scorzonera, often called black salsify, was another crop Grandma knew that many have forgotten. Its long, dark roots looked plain on the outside, but once peeled and cooked, they were tender with a flavor close to parsnips. Dug in the cool of fall, Scorzonera kept well in the cellar, ready to be boiled, baked, or fried in butter. Families leaned on it as a dependable root, one that filled bowls when choices were few. Children remembered the sticky white sap that clung to their hands as they helped peel the roots, laughing at the mess it made. On cold nights, Scorzonera was mixed into soups or served with potatoes, stretching meals a little further. It was never the star of the garden, but it carried its weight when winters were long. Turnip greens, purple top. When Grandma planted purple top turnips, she made sure nothing went to waste. The roots went into storage, but the greens were gathered in the fall and cooked fresh. Simmered with onions, pork, or just a splash of vinegar, they turned into a dish that filled the house with a hearty smell. Families remembered bowls of tender greens on cold evenings, the steam rising as the windows frosted over. Children sometimes picked the leaves themselves, their hands chilled as they carried them into the kitchen. These greens didn't last long in storage, so they were enjoyed right away, adding strength to meals before the real cold set in. For many households, turnip greens were a reminder that even the humblest part of the garden had a place on the winter table. Parsnip, hollow crown. Parsnips were one of Grandma's sweetest secrets, though they didn't look like much when pulled from the soil. Hollow crown, an heirloom variety, grew long and pale, its flavor improving after frost. Families roasted them with meats, mashed them with butter, or simmered them into soups that carried warmth through the darkest days. Children remembered their earthy scent as the roots were scrubbed at the sink, mud clinging stubbornly to the skin. In the cellar, parsnips kept for months, ready whenever the table needed more than potatoes. Their sweetness made them a favorite for winter meals, even among those who first turned up their noses. Hollow crown parsnips carried households through long seasons, proving that simple roots could bring both comfort and nourishment when little else remained fresh. Grandma's garden held more than just the crops we remember today. These forgotten foods filled our plates and kept families strong through the hardest months of the year. They may have slipped from most gardens, but the lessons remain. Simple, steady, and reliable. That was how our grandparents made it through. If you enjoyed this look back at their forgotten crops, give this video a hype and subscribe. so we can keep these traditions alive for the next generation of gardeners.